Thank you. Well, good evening. Oh, come on, folks. We're in Little Rock. Good evening. There you go. There you go. Thank you, Stephanie, for that kind introduction. As you go through the things that I've done and I start to hear the years, I get increasingly concerned about how long it's been since I was whatever position. It was interesting to go by the Clinton Library and to see that which is now receding into history and to think I lived so much of that. Another reminder that I'm getting on in years. But nevertheless, it is a wonderful facility, and I want to thank everybody who was so kind to show us around. It is really a privilege to be here with all of you tonight and to be among so many friends, colleagues, and critical partners. I want to thank Stephanie and Dean Rutherford, as well as the faculty and students of the Clinton School of Public Service and the Clinton Presidential Center staff, board members, and ever-expanding network of supporters for inviting me and welcoming me here to Little Rock and for providing a forum for what I think is a very important discussion. Now, as a proud alum, and I am a very proud alum of the Clinton administration, I'm especially grateful for all that you do to honor the extraordinary achievements of our nation's 42nd Commander-in-Chief and to build upon his historic and ongoing efforts to ensure the strength of our democracy and to fulfill America's most fundamental and most sacred promises of security, of liberty, and of justice for all. Now, because of you, the Center not only stands as a monument to the achievements that marked the Clinton presidency, it also serves as a meeting ground for essential learning and thoughtful debate, for advocacy and for action, and for discussion about issues of national urgency and of global consequence. This evening, we have come together to focus on such an issue and to contribute to an important national dialogue about how we can advance our nation's long struggle for fairness and freedom, and specifically how we can more successfully identify, assist, and seek justice on behalf of the millions of human trafficking victims who have been trapped in some form of slavery, bonded labor, or forced prostitution. Now, this conversation could not be more important or more urgent. And it's fitting, I think, that we've gathered for it during National Crime Victims' Rights Week. Now, for more than 2 decades, this annual observance has provided an opportunity for Americans to reflect upon and to recommit themselves to meeting the needs of those whose lives have been shattered by violence, abuse, exploitation, and modern-day forms of peonage and bondage. It is alarming and almost unfathomable to consider that 150 years since President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, more than 6 decades after the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights prohibited the practice of slavery on a global scale, and nearly a dozen years from the day that, with President Clinton's approval, the landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act became law, that today, in communities across and beyond this country, slavery persists. In fact, according to the United Nations, there are up to 27 million people worldwide who currently toil in bondage. And this is more than at any other time in human history. Now, without question, this problem has reached crisis proportions. But in many ways, the challenges now before us are anything but new. And I was reminded of this fact earlier today as I toured the Clinton Center, where a statue of our nation's most famous, and I would argue most courageous abolitionist, Harriet Tubman, now stands. It is inscribed with one of her most eloquent and enduring directives. It says, "If you are tired, keep going. If you are hungry, keep going. If you are scared, keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. Keep going." Now, those words, first shared during one of the darkest periods in American history, remain relevant today. They were issued as an assurance and received as a promise that in this great country, justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied, and that those who are willing to cling to hope, to move toward progress, and to follow the North Star of freedom will be met with assistance and bestowed with the rights and opportunities that every person, everywhere, deserves. Today, this promise is ours to fulfill. And I am convinced that we can no longer tell those who suffer in the shadows, trapped by fear and trapped by force, to keep faith in this pledge and to keep going unless we are willing to lead the way forward. And this work must begin now. And it must start by being clear about what exactly we are up against. Today, a growing number of Americans are aware of and are concerned about human trafficking. But many assume it is a problem only beyond our borders. And this belief, quite simply, is false. In communities nationwide, human trafficking victims often are hiding in plain sight. The young woman who traveled to America for the promise of a new life but finds herself enslaved and sold for sex. The child who was born here but ran away from home and in desperation accepted help from the wrong person. The migrant worker who was deprived of identification, transportation, health care, and access to money in order to ensure complete dependence on his employer. Or one of the many young girls regularly shuttled to truck stops along I-40 who was filled with shame and empty of hope, living in fear of incarceration and in doubt of her ability to survive on her own. By their traffickers, these victims are viewed and treated as nothing more than commodities, and they are driving an illicit and thriving economy that is based on the sale of human beings and primarily on the enslavement and exploitation of women and children. Now, as incomprehensible as it seems, trafficking in girls is an increasingly prevalent part of gang activities. These crimes are seen as low risk and high reward. They bring in more profits and often result in less prison time than dealing drugs. As one journalist who was covering instances of human trafficking here in Arkansas explained, and I quote, "You can only sell a drug once, but you can sell a human being over and over and over." Today, these transactions can be executed quickly, conveniently, and anonymously over the internet, and many of them involve young children. According to the Justice Department's recent estimates, more than 40% of all human trafficking incidents opened for investigation were for sexual trafficking of a child. And the overwhelming majority of these victims, more than 80% of them, were identified as U.S. citizens. Now, make no mistake, human trafficking is not just a global problem. It is a national crisis, one that every parent, every teacher, every policymaker, and every law enforcement official must work to understand and must help to address. Now, of course, many of you already know this, and some of you have learned about the prevalence and the impact of this problem in the hardest of ways, by experiencing it in your own life or by working directly with victims. You've seen how in too many of our communities and businesses, the poorest and the most vulnerable among us are being robbed of basic rights to dignity, security, and opportunity. But instead of despair, you've responded with dedication and with the resolve necessary to fight back. I am especially grateful for the work being done by leaders like United States Attorney Chris Thayer, Attorney General Dustin McDaniel, Sheriff Doc Holliday, and Chief Stuart Thomas, whose commitment to aggressive enforcement, to increased collaboration, and to victim assistance is making a meaningful, measurable difference here in Arkansas. And I stand in awe of advocates like Kathy Finley, the founder of Safe Places and a Justice Department grantee, who is bringing hope and essential services to abused and exploited women and children across this city, and of Louise Allen, a former trafficking victim and the founder of Partners Against Trafficking Humans, known as PATH, who transformed her own painful experience into a powerful effort that is helping women and girls here in Little Rock find healing and the support they need to rebuild their lives. These dedicated public servants and so many of the other allies and partners here today are doing really invaluable work to bring human trafficking crimes to light and to justice, and to stand up for the rights and interests of victims. I want each of you to know that I am proud, and that this Department of Justice is proud to stand with you. Now, as Attorney General and as the father of 3 teenage children, advancing current efforts to identify and to prosecute human traffickers and to support those who serve and assist victims is both a professional and a personal priority. For today's Justice Department, our commitment to this work has never been stronger. Our approach, I don't believe, has ever been more effective. And our message that in this country and under this administration, human trafficking will not be tolerated, and that a zero-tolerance, one-strike approach has taken hold, I don't think could be more clear. By adopting this approach over the last 3 years, we've achieved significant increases in human trafficking prosecutions, including a rise of more than 30% in the number of forced labor and adult sex trafficking prosecutions. And in just the past year, we charged nearly 120 defendants, which is a record number, in human trafficking cases. Now, much of this work is being led by the Department's Civil Rights Division and its specialized Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, which was established 5 years ago. Under the leadership of its director, Hillary Axsom, who I'm glad is here with us this evening, this vital prosecution unit has been on the front lines in enforcing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But it isn't working alone. It is supported and strengthened by the Criminal Division and its Child Exploitation and Obscenity section, its Organized Crime and Racketeering section, its Offices of International Affairs and Overseas Prosecutorial Development Assistance and Training, and its International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program. Our Office of Justice Programs and its Office for Victims of Crime and Bureau of Justice Assistance also play a key role. In addition, the FBI, the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, and U.S. Attorneys' offices across the country are providing critical leadership in bringing human traffickers to justice. And the Department is now working to bring even more partners together to advance our human trafficking efforts. Now, because we know that these heinous crimes can arise in any criminal context, and because it is not uncommon for traffickers to be involved in a variety of other criminal enterprises, such as the trafficking of drugs or firearms and financial laundering schemes, we are taking steps to ensure that investigators and prosecutors who work on organized crime, gang, and financial crime cases are fully trained to identify human crimes and human trafficking victims. And when the Justice Department itself engages in procurement, we have an obligation, and we will be taking action to make certain that our management staff and contractors are fully trained themselves to ensure that the Department does not engage suppliers or contractors with questionable or exploitive labor practices. Now, this sort of training has been expertly developed by our partners in the Department of Homeland Security and Defense. And the Justice Department will join them in demanding clear and visible zero-tolerance policies among our vendors, contractors, subcontractors, and employees. Victims of trafficking at home and around the world deserve nothing less. Now, by expanding the scope of our efforts internally, I'm confident that we can build upon the historic progress that's been achieved since last February, when the Justice Department launched a new Human Trafficking Enhanced Enforcement Initiative. As part of this groundbreaking effort, I announced the Anti-Trafficking Coordination Team, or ACT Team, initiative. It's an interagency collaboration among the Departments of Justice, Homeland Security, and Labor, aimed at streamlining federal criminal investigations and prosecutions of human trafficking offenses. And following a rigorous interagency selection process, we launched 6 pilot ACT teams around the country in Atlanta, El Paso, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Memphis, and Miami, cities with extremely serious and dangerous human trafficking problems. Today, these teams are fully operational, and they're allowing us to develop and to advance high-impact human trafficking prosecutions. For example, by bringing federal investigative agencies like the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and federal prosecutors together, over the last year we have succeeded in dismantling a large transnational organized criminal enterprise that held Ukrainian victims in forced labor in Philadelphia. We brought freedom and dignity to undocumented Central American women and convicted the traffickers who, with threats and violent abuse, compelled them into forced labor and prostitution in restaurants and bars on Long Island in New York. We restored freedom to undocumented Eastern European women and convicted the trafficker who brutally exploited them in massage parlors in Chicago and even branded them with tattoos to claim them as his property. We sought justice against members of a violent trafficking group that transported 10 young women, including 4 minors, from Mexico to Atlanta, where these victims were held captive, regularly beaten, forced into prostitution, and in some cases raped by dozens of men in a single night. Now, the ringleader of this group is now behind bars and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. We also secured a life sentence against a violent gang member in the Eastern District of Virginia for the sex trafficking of a young girl. A 12-year-old runaway who was promised a place to stay, but instead was forced into prostitution, regularly plied with alcohol and drugs, and on a daily basis made to have sex with multiple men, a 12-year-old. In another case prosecuted in Virginia's Eastern District, in which low-level workers were trafficked from Mexico into the United States and forced to produce and sell illegal documents, critical enforcement and investigative efforts span multiple jurisdictions, including here in Little Rock. And today I'm grateful for the opportunity to salute and to personally thank the members of the Little Rock Police Department and the Arkansas State Crime Lab who are here with us and whose contributions were really instrumental in securing 2 consecutive life sentences against the leader of this criminal enterprise. These convictions and lengthy sentences, I think, have sent an important and powerful message that traffickers will be stopped and they will be punished to the fullest extent of the law. However, despite these and many other recent successes, there is much more work to be done and far too many people in need of our help. That's why the Justice Department is supporting innovative, collaborative efforts to identify and to stop traffickers and to help victims heal and to rebuild their lives. We're working to sustain and to enhance support for victim service organizations across the country. And we're providing critical grant funding, technical assistance, and cutting-edge training that incorporates guidance from trafficking victims to our state and local law enforcement partners who are uniquely and often best positioned to detect human trafficking crimes. Over the last year, these efforts have included hosting 3 regional training forums focused on improving collaboration, as well as the development of a training curriculum to help state prosecutors and judges better understand human trafficking crimes. We're also taking steps to forge and to strengthen partnerships across international borders, which, as we've seen repeatedly, are essential. For example, under this administration and by working with Mexican law enforcement authorities, we dismantled sex trafficking networks operating on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, bringing freedom to the victims and securing landmark convictions and substantial sentences against the traffickers in these high-impact bilateral cases. And we're working with our counterparts in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe, in Africa, Australia, and beyond to establish similar partnerships and to ensure that the global movement to end human trafficking has the attention, the resources, and the political support that it deserves. Here in the United States, we can all be encouraged by the fact that policy leaders from both parties, are deeply committed to this effort. Early in his presidency, President Obama declared January as National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and calling on our nation to acknowledge modern-day slavery and to recommit ourselves to stopping and preventing human trafficking. This call has been echoed by many other key committed leaders, from a woman I think you all know, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, to Congressman Frank, yes, sure. From Secretary of State Clinton to Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia, and by both Senators Mark Pryor and John Bozeman, and by governors, mayors, attorneys general, and district and county attorneys really nationwide. Let me assure you, the Department of Justice is committed, and I am committed to answering this call. As part of this commitment, we are taking our interagency partnerships to the next level. For example, we are working more closely than ever before with the Departments of Health and Human Services and Education to more fully integrate human trafficking awareness and victim assistance into programs serving runaway and homeless youth, abused and neglected children, minors in the juvenile justice system, and other young people who are most vulnerable to trafficking. This outreach will advance federal efforts to locate and to assist youth victims and to prevent trafficking crimes before they occur. Now, beyond this, we must seek out additional opportunities to enhance our most successful programs and to engage even more healthcare providers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials in our anti-trafficking and victim services efforts. We're also working to increase strategic and operational coordination across a host of Justice Department components, including the criminal and civil rights divisions, U.S. Attorney's offices, the FBI, and the Office of Justice programs that are at the forefront of this fight every day. In recent years, as the volume and the sophistication of our anti-trafficking efforts have increased, We've learned that strengthening our unified response to human trafficking crimes will require us to increase awareness and engagement across the Department of Justice, to reinforce partnerships with state, local, and tribal officials, and to bring additional agencies and non-governmental organizations into this work. And that's why I'm planning to designate a department employee to oversee our robust internal, external, and interagency efforts. This step will allow the department to continue to break new ground and to more quickly develop and implement the most effective possible approaches for meeting our shared public safety goals and our moral obligation of preventing human trafficking, protecting victims across the country, punishing perpetrators, and empowering victims to move forward as survivors. Now, but I also recognize that we will never be able to make the progress that we need on our own, and that our partnerships must continue to expand beyond government. We must work with victims and victim advocates to extend our impact in helping to make lives whole again. We must question not only why advertisements for the services of young women can be readily found on so many publications and web pages, but also why some publishers and internet service providers are still making excuses and providing justifications for business practices that are immoral and that support trafficking. And we must do even more to reach out across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors and engage additional local, state, tribal, federal, and international partners in fulfilling the responsibilities that we all share. Only by working together can the United States continue to be a leader in the global fight against human trafficking. Only by working together can we protect and extend the progress that's been made by generations of activists, advocates, and abolitionists. Only by working together can we honor our most fundamental American ideals, that we are inextricably connected to and must care about each other, that the strength of our nation and the prosperity of its citizens depends on how we treat and how well we protect the weakest and most vulnerable among us. And as President Clinton, unsurprisingly, may have summed it up best on the day that the Clinton Center was dedicated in his honor, that in this great country, and I quote him, everybody counts. So let us come together to ensure that these words always hold truth and to advance our nation's long walk toward liberty and justice for all. Let us continue this discussion and keep up our work. And above all, on behalf of those who are tired, who are hungry or scared, and who yearn for the taste of freedom, let us keep going. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Would you please raise your hand? I will recognize you and then wait till the microphone gets to you. So are there questions? And sometimes I can't see because of the light. Who is there a question? All right. Oh, Ms. Abrams, of course. Why would I miss that one?
Thank you, Skip. We want to welcome you here, and this audience tells you how welcome you are as a representative of the President. My question is going to deal with what I didn't hear you speak about. Bullying, I believe, is the seed for how this plague is working across all of our countries. I did not hear anything in your speech that tells us about how we must diminish the culture of don't be a snitch. It's not just at the youth level, but it's at the most high. We don't want to be classified as a snitch. We don't see ourselves as activists and civil rights workers. Would you speak to that, please?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the problem that you identify is a very real one, and it's why we've tried to take steps in the Obama administration to reconnect people in law enforcement to the communities that they serve. I saw it as a judge in Washington, D.C., as the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., as Deputy Attorney General, a gap that was growing between certain communities and people in law enforcement. And we have tried to reach out to make sure that we decrease that gap by doing a number of things. Among them, for instance, dealing with the disparity that existed between the sentencing provisions for crack and powder cocaine. That 100-to-1 ratio bred disrespect for law enforcement, made people less willing to share information with people in law enforcement. We have also had a series of community outreach programs where we have reached out and worked with law enforcement to make people in law enforcement, and it's interesting because the people who are on the streets get this. People in law enforcement on the streets really kind of get this, that there's the need to connect people on the streets in law enforcement with the communities that they serve. And come up with, and that's one of the reasons why President Clinton's 100,000 police officers, that was so successful in reducing our crime rate. It has come down to historic lows, and I think the foundation for that was laid by President Clinton. This new notion of community policing breaks down the notion of people being snitches. If you have regular interactions, regular communications, then when you're passing on relevant information, it's not snitching, it's just consistent with what it is you do on a normal basis. So those are the kinds of things that began with President Clinton and that we are continuing with President Obama.
Yes, I have a question right here, Marcina.
Hi, my name is Mokshida. I'm a second-year Clinton School student, and I'm from Nepal. My question is, do you think Clinton's policies and free trade resulted in the loss of food independence in other countries? And if so, how has this contributed to human trafficking in these countries? Thank you.
Well, I think that President Clinton's policies on free trade, when viewed in their totality, really benefit the world as a whole. By knocking down artificial barriers and promoting trade, you increase the ability to meet needs that exist in different parts of the world. If you remember those battles, dealing with NAFTA and all the other things that we had to deal with, I think that as we look back now, and knocking down other barriers and things that President Obama is trying to do now on a bilateral basis, that as we get rid of those barriers, we see increases in trade, and that means trade in everything. It increases the ability of farmers in the United States to get food to places where it's needed in other parts of the world. When we have the desire to protect markets or to put up artificial barriers, that necessarily has a negative impact, I think, just across the board, whether you're dealing with manufactured goods or goods that come from agriculture. So I think that the policies that President Clinton started, that President Obama has been following and amplifying on, are good in that regard.
Question. There's a question right back at the back. Yes, sir. We're waiting for our member. Can't see because of the lights. If you'll stand up, and then the microphone will come to you.
Hi, Attorney General. Thank you for being here, and thank you for speaking about human trafficking. I had a question about a little bit of a different subject. There's been a rash of Brady and Giglio violations down in New Orleans recently. I'm not sure if you're aware, but it's been kind of all over the news. Times-Picayune, Slate.com. And I was just wondering if the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division might make this a priority to investigate and use its powers to ensure that prosecutors in New Orleans abide by the United States Constitution.
Yeah, we are doing a whole variety of things in New Orleans. I'm doing something important for New Orleans. I'm sending one of my daughters to college down there in August. So this is personal. Not that she's going to need to be involved in the criminal justice system. I hope not. But it's been very publicly announced. We are engaged now in a pattern of practice investigation of the New Orleans Police Department, and I expect that we're going to have an announcement in that regard in the next few weeks. We work with the new mayor there, Mayor Landrieu, who I think has done a good job in trying to deal with some of these issues, and frankly, a culture that exists in New Orleans that has to be dealt with. We had recent convictions of police officers who shot and killed people after the floods on the Danziger Bridge. There's a whole variety of things that I think point to a system that is in distress in New Orleans. And the whole question of Brady and Giglio information, for those who aren't lawyers, Brady information is exculpatory information, information that would tend to show that a defendant didn't do the crime that was charged, and prosecutors have an obligation to turn over that information to the defense before the trial so that the defense can make use of that information. It's really a fundamental obligation. And the concerns that you expressed are ones that we have as well, and really a part of the overall look that we're taking at the criminal justice system in New Orleans. It is not a system, quite frankly, that I think is in as good a shape as it should be, but I think it will be better. It won't get, it will not become well immediately, but I think over time, and with the continued focus that this Justice Department and this mayor are pledged to do, that over time the system will reflect the wonderfulness of that city. But it is a system that's in trouble right now.
Trish, right here. Second row here.
Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Trish Flanagan, and I'm a Clinton School student. My question for you is, can you just, well, it's actually more of a request, can you sort of describe a little bit more you had mentioned a personal connection to this issue of human trafficking, given that you have young teenage children, because I think that most of us here in this room and most of us in the United States may or may not have a very close understanding or sort of relative experience to understand how real this actually is. So you had mentioned that you sort of feel a personal connection to this, having children. Can you kind of explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, when I read the reports that are both infuriating and heartbreaking about the kind of treatment that young people and young girls are subjected to, young women. I think about my 18-year-old daughter, my 16-year-old daughter, and it is, just looking at these reports that come across my desk, or the reports of convictions that we have received, you see human depravity, cruelty on a scale that is almost unimaginable. I mean, how could one human being do something like that to another human being, especially when that other human being is so young, vulnerable, full of promise? You essentially rob them of their futures. And that's why it's so important to try to rebuild those opportunities at having a productive future. But I'm always struck when I read about these 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds. I think about my girls, Maya and Brooke, who I love more than life itself. And I wonder about the parents of these girls that I read about, the relatives of these girls who I read about. What must they be feeling? What must they be wondering? Because perhaps they don't know where their daughters are. And to the extent that they then are reunited, how do they deal with these beautiful young girls, these young women whose lives have been so impacted in a negative way? And it does, for me, become personal. And I think it's the kind of thing that we all have to make personal. Because essentially, these young girls, these young women, they are our daughters. They're all our daughters. They may not be related to us by blood, even by nationality, but they are our daughters, and we have to think of it in that way. And young men as well, who are unfortunately caught up in this. And we have to feel that connection, whether it is something that happens in this country or in other countries. I was reading about the plight of young Afghan boys and how they are exploited and forced into sexual relationships with older men. I've got a 14-year-old boy. And again, I think, I think about him, Eric III, better known as Buddy. And I was reading about, it was a 14-year-old, and again, thinking about, there's an article in the Washington Post and some reports I read about how parents there, because they don't have power, have to let their son go with a more powerful person, don't have any redress in the court system there, and think about what does that do, not only to that terrible things it does to that boy, but what is the powerlessness that a parent has got to feel. And so I think we have to, as a nation, as individuals, find ways in which we take American power, moral suasion that we have to rectify these situations wherever we find them. But understand that it's not only in Afghanistan, it's not only in Southeast Asia, it's here in the United States as well.
We have a question over here in the back corner, the guy standing up. He's been way over there. It's a long way.
Welcome. We're just finishing up the book Half the Sky by Nicholas Kristof in my class, my international relations class. We have about 30 students here that are reading it right now, and it deals a lot with the human trafficking issue, so we really appreciate your visit. It's very timely. Does the fact that a kind of a symbiotic relationship exists between human trafficking and drugs and other nefarious activities make interagency cooperation problematic? You mentioned about the number of agencies involved in the issue. But when you're talking about multiple problems that kind of work together, does this create difficulty for your department?
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on something that is extremely important. I think there is a realization that I wouldn't say has just hit us, but something that is of recent vintage, that people who engage in human trafficking are also engaging in a variety of other crimes, and that we needed to train narcotics agents. You needed to train people who deal in gun crimes to look for the signs of trafficking, of human trafficking, that the people, when you go into a stash house or something like that and you see young girls there or young women there, understand that there might be going on more there than simply the narcotics trade. And so interagency collaboration is important. And as anybody knows, to break through these bureaucratic obstacles is often a very difficult thing. But I think what we have seen within our administration, and I think at the state and local level as well, working with the federal partners, that there is that growing awareness and the desire to focus on, not turf, but on victims. And so I think we're in a much better place than we were, but frankly, we're not at the place where yet we need to be. We still need to make the very specialized units that we have in all of our law enforcement agencies understand that they might have a special purpose, a special role to play in law enforcement, but they have to be sensitized to this human trafficking issue, which is found in a whole variety of other contexts. So it's something that we are working on, and as I said, I think that we are better at, but still need to be in a better place than we are now.
Yes, ma'am, right here in the center. Stand right. Yes, yeah.
We have to call on this young woman here who's pulling her hair. I promise.
Hi, thank you, sir, for being here. I'm Ramona Anderson. I'm a student at the William H. Bowen School of Law. On an international level, being that smuggling, whether in or out of the United States, is such a contributing factor to human trafficking, are there any initiatives in terms of on the immigration law level that are in place or planned?
Well, it's interesting that, let me kind of lead into the question this way. I mean, we as a nation have got to deal with this immigration problem just generally. We have to understand that we can't, for political purposes, make political slogans about an issue that Ronald Reagan dealt with when he was president. And it's an issue, it's a big issue that this nation has got to grapple with. There are a huge number of undocumented people in this country. We have a border that needs to be protected, and we need to come up with a comprehensive solution to that problem. That's kind of the foundation for all of this stuff. And it is an indictment of the situation in Washington, D.C., that we have been unable to do that, to break through that. Maybe it's not going to happen between now and November the 6th, but my hope would be that after November the 6th and in President Obama's second term, that Republicans and Democrats will be able to see their way to come up with that. And once you establish that foundation, things become easier. The mechanisms that I think would have to be put in place for bilateral cooperation with Mexico, for instance, with other nations with whom we have these immigration issues. You know, we have a whole host of other ways in which we can cooperate with one another. And yeah, we have established relationships with various partners around the world, initiatives that we have put in place. We have our people in other parts of the world to try to deal with the trafficking problems that exist there, and trafficking problems that exist in other parts of the world that get exported to the United States. We're cognizant of the fact that we simply can't be in the United States and think that we can deal with the problem. We have to have our people outside of our borders, and we do that.
Okay, our final question, the lady that's pulling her hair out right over here. Let's get the microphone to her. Wait a minute, here comes the microphone. In fact, we're giving her 2 microphones.
All right. I'm Judy Ladd, and I'm from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and I campaigned for Bill Clinton. So you're a good guy. But my question, and I've got several.
Just got time for one, so go ahead.
Okay, when a young girl is disappeared, so to speak, she's listed as a runaway. Well, how do you get the police to act promptly and recognize that this girl may have been kidnapped, as they used to when children were first gone? You know, they have to wait 24 hours. Now they act immediately with the Angie's Law, or whatever it's called, Amber's Law. So, you know, how can we get the police to respond in the same manner that girls don't just walk away from home?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, law enforcement's in a fundamentally different place than we were. You know, it's interesting, we have seen the recent digging that happened in New York with regard to the case involving Eitan Pates, a case that I remember, you know, quite well, I guess from the late 70s, early 80s. And you think about where we were as a nation back then and where we are now. The notion that a child could disappear and that we would not take some immediate action, some kind of notification, Amber Alerts, you know, other things that happen. It's not how we operate in the United States anymore. Systems are not perfect, you know. There are still too many times, I think, when we take a little too much time before we deal with the possibility that somebody, especially older children, you know, when you're dealing with 8-year-olds and 6-year-olds, I mean, that's one thing, but when you're dealing with older children, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, that we have to be aware of the fact that even if some child leaves voluntarily, that doesn't necessarily mean that the inquiry stops there, because leaving voluntarily, seemingly voluntarily, with the help of some helping adult from a bad home situation can lead to the things I talked about in my prepared remarks. And so we have to sensitize people in law enforcement, but we have to sensitize this nation to being aware of situations that don't look quite right. You know, why is somebody, an 18-year-old dealing or with an older man, not related to her? We have to, as a nation, you know, sensitize ourselves, embolden ourselves to ask questions about things like that, to notify the authorities, to make sure that somebody a young woman might have gone voluntarily is now being held against her will. Again, we've made progress, but it's a law enforcement responsibility primarily, but it is really a problem for the entirety of our nation. And I think if we really care as much as we say we do about the welfare of our children, all of us have to become involved. All of us have to be willing to extend ourselves and do things that sometimes are uncomfortable, you know, which is to, you know, ask questions and ask the police or phone things in. You know, you don't want to necessarily, you know, people, I think, tend to want to not get involved in some ways. That's understandable. But at the end of the day, what's most important from my perspective is the welfare of this nation's children. And so, as I said, I think this is our problem, and it's our problem to solve.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Attorney General of the United States. I want to thank the Attorney General. Thank you to the Kumpuris family. Ms. Kumpuris, nice to see you. Good to see you out. Thank you to the Clinton Foundation, Stephanie, Terry, and the Clinton Library, and AT&T, Ronnie, and your group. Thank you all for being with us. We were grateful for the Attorney General being here. He spent some time with our students this afternoon, and it was a great experience. Thank you all. Have a nice evening.